Welcome to Highline Excel 2016 class video number 17. Hey, if you want to download this Excel workbook file, Business 218 Video 7 Start. There's also the finished file. There's also PDF files and the zipped folder with text files we're going to need for the dashboard project. You can click on the link below the video. Wow, this is a video about how to build dashboards. We're going to have pivot tables, charts, conditional formatting. Our data will be stored in the data model, and we're going to get to see our first DAX formula, which are formulas for pivot tables. Here's our entire list of all the steps in building our dashboard. I want to go over to the finished file and click on the dashboard sheet. Here's what we want to try and accomplish. Here's a slicer. When I click on 2017, my line chart for revenue for all of the months, my bar chart for the different sales reps and their revenue amount, and my cross-tabulated table with product and region, and our conditional formatting all will change when we click on the slicer. Not only that, but one of the hallmarks of a dashboard is when new data becomes available, I can simply refresh, and I'm going to use the keyboard Control-Alt-F5. And now there's a lot of data being imported, and there our data source has been updated with 2018 and instantly appears in our slicer and all of our charts, cross-tabulated pivot table, and our conditional formatting. All can see that. All right, let's go and create this dashboard. We're going to go to the Start file, and I actually want to look at the sheet notes just for a moment. A dashboard is simply a data visualization that presents useful information and metrics that will update automatically when new data become available. Dashboards can contain various types of visualization from tables of data, charts, data validation, pictures, or other visualizations. Now let's go over to the sheet Dashboard. Now step one is connecting to the data source. And actually, before we do that, let's go back to the Topics sheet here. We have a lot of steps here in creating this dashboards. We have to import the data. We have to clean the data. We have to create 4 different pivot tables, 2 different charts, and some important formulas. So this is a lot of steps that go into creating this dashboard. Let's go over to Dashboard Sheet. And step 1 is to import the data. And we are going to use Data and Get and Transform. But before we do that, let's go look at Windows Explorer and look at the folder and files that we're going to import. Now, when you download this, you download the zipped version of Video 17 import files. When you unzip it, there will be a Start folder and a 2018 text file. I'm going to double click to open up and look at what's in the Start folder, because these are the files that we're going to import to start building our data model, our pivot tables, charts, and so on. Later, we'll update this folder with the latest data, and then everything will update inside of Excel. Now, why text files? Text files are often used to communicate between data storage system or systems that use the data. So the 2016 and 17 data was exported into this text format. All right, I'm going to click the back button. When we are over in Excel, we're actually going to point Excel to that Start folder. Right now, there's only 2 files in there. But later, when we add more files to that folder, Excel will automatically see them and import them when we refresh. All right, let's go over to Excel. Now, to import those text files, we go to Data and Get and Transform. Now, Get and Transform group and the new query we're going to use, this is all new in Excel 2016. This whole group right here used to be a separate tab called Power Query, and you used to have to download it and install the add-in. But in 2016, Get and Transform is our Power Query. We go to New Query, From File, and down here, From Folder. Our Browse window will open up. Click Browse. Now, there's our first folder, and we want to select the Start folder. What we're telling Power Query is please import all files from inside that folder. When I click OK, If you get this intermediate step, click Edit. We get inside our Power Query Editor, we get a list of all of the files and information about the files. Now we want to come over here and be sure and name it. We always want to name our query and the table that will be imported into the data model a smart name. So I'm going to call this something like transaction table and enter. If we need to come back and edit our query, that's the name of the query. Later, this will be the name of the table in the data model. Now, we are importing only text files. If we had other types of file and we needed to filter them out, we would use this filter button. But we don't. We're only going to have text files in that folder. So we're not going to need any of these columns. I come to the content column, right-click, remove other columns, and instantly they're all gone. Now watch this. Our steps for our query are being memorized over here. Later, when we need to refresh because there's new data, these steps will automatically be repeated. Now content, there's this little double downward pointing arrow. We click on this to expand our text files. And check that out. There's all of our columns. Now, part of the import process is also cleaning our data and transforming it. Now, there's a bunch of columns we don't need. Transaction number we don't need, so I'm going to click on that. Before I click on website, I'm going to hold the Control key because I don't need that column either. Then I'm holding Control, units, discount, price. All of these columns we do not need. Particularly with big data, you want to remove any extra data that you don't need. Now I'm going to right-click, remove columns. Now look over here. We have a bunch of steps memorized, including, look at that, promote headers. It actually took the text file and the very first record, it promoted as the headers. Now one problem is we have multiple files, and each one of those files had the same field names. So way down in the bottom of our data set, there are some rogue or extra field names we don't need. The field names down below in the data set are being treated as a record. So we're going to come up to one of the columns, and I'm going to pick the column with the fewest number of unique records, and I'm going to filter out that extra field name. So I'm going to click the drop down. Now, one thing that happens with large data is this filter list is polite. It says list may be incomplete, so please click the load more. For larger data sets, that takes a while, right? But instantly now we see a unique list. And there's our field name that's listed down below. By unchecking this, we're going to filter out type in the type column. It will also filter out the entire record, which means it'll filter out the extra field names in the tables listed below. Now, when I click OK, that step is memorized over here. When we rerun this, anytime we add new tables, that step right there will filter out the extra field names. Now, there's one other bit of data we want to filter out. The try-fly product does not have very many transactions, not much revenue, and we don't want to analyze that particular product. But I'm actually going to make a mistake and forget to filter it out. And later, after we create our charts and pivot tables, we'll notice our mistake. We'll actually come back to this query, edit it, click refresh, and everything will update. So one amazing thing about Power Query is all of these steps for importing, transforming, and cleaning are memorized. Whether we add new files or need to come back here later to refine our cleaning and transforming, that makes Power Query amazing. Now we want to do one last thing, which is check each column. We want to check the data type to make sure we got the right data type. Date and time is perfect. These ones are text. Each one of them looks like text, and this one is decimal number. Now, sometimes when you have numbers, you'll see that they show up as text, and that causes big trouble later on if you try to build pivot tables. So you want to make sure and check that initially. If you forget, you can always come back and edit later. All right, now we're ready to load this, and I'm not going to click Close and Load right there. I want to click Close and Load To, because we want to send this to the data model. Now, by default, it says table. We do not want to dump this data into a table. We want to say only create a connection and then come down and check add this to the data model. Now, there's a bunch of advantages to the data model. In particular, if you have a lot of data, you don't want to load it into the Excel sheet in a table because it takes up a lot of space. Not only that, but there's a lot of efficiencies, and we'll see for the first time in this video, formulas that we can create in the data model. You can build relationships between tables. We saw that in an earlier video. So we're dumping it into the data model. Only create a connection data model. Let's click Load. And we can see over here on the right, there's our table, 5,918 records. Now we want to go look at the data model. We can either go to Data, and there's our Manage Data Model, or Power Pivot and Manage Data Model. And there is our table, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns got imported. We can see there's our name. That's the name of the table in the data model. It's also the name of our query. There's the number of records. Earlier in the class, we actually went to diagram view because we had multiple tables and we needed to create a relationship. In this video, we have just one table. Now, we're actually going to analyze revenue, and we'll analyze it based on year and month, sales rep, region, and product. Now, we'll come back to the data model later and look at formulas and also some extra columns that are going to be added to our table here when we group in the pivot table. Now, I want to create our first pivot table. So I'm going to click this. I definitely want it on a new sheet. Click OK. I'm immediately going to come and double-click and name this sheet Month Report and Enter. Now, our first pivot table is going to, and I'm going to drag the fill list over here, is going to be a year and month revenue report. Now, this table and all of the fields are from the data model. In earlier versions before Excel 2016, we were not allowed to group a date field if it was from the data model. We actually had to build a calendar table and build a relationship. Now, there are still huge advantages to building a calendar table and relationships because of a lot of the time intelligence functions, and for big data, it has some calculation advantages. But if you have a single table with the date column in the data model, it would be pretty convenient to simply drag this down to rows and be able to group it. Well, they added that feature in Excel 2016. So watch this. Brand new, if I drag a date field from the data model down to rows, watch this. It takes a second because it actually creates a bunch of new columns over in the data model. But there it is, year and month. I can drag the quarter off. I don't need this date and time either. If I come over and right-click, expand entire field, there. That is simply amazing that the data model can now group by month and year. Now, in the last week of our class, we'll talk a lot more about the data model, and we will see the advantages to a calendar table. But if you have a single table in your data model and you want to automatically group by month and year, that is beautiful that they added this. Now, let's go look at the data model. Alt-Tab. There it is. 1, 2, 3, 4 extra columns. That is pretty amazing to simply drag and drop. We don't ever even have to know anything about these columns, right? We're just using the data model because it's efficient for various reasons. And boom, there it is. Now, our next step is instead of clicking and dragging net revenue down to values and using the built-in sum function inside the pivot table, which is, by the way, called an implicit calculation, we want to explicitly build a formula that will calculate net revenue. Now, this is the first time we're going to see a DAX formula. These are formulas specifically built for pivot tables that exist in the data model only. The advantage that we will see in this video is that a new field will be added called revenue in our case, because we'll name it revenue, and we will create the calculation and add the number formatting. And when we drag this field to multiple pivot tables, it will automatically calculate and automatically have the number formatting. Now, again, later in this class, we'll learn more about DAX formulas and different functions. But here, this is the Power Pivot ribbon tab, calculations. And oh, they're called measures, which are really formulas. Now, I want to go over to the notes because there's some terminology we want to talk about. Power Pivot DAX measures are really formulas for pivot tables. Now, what does DAX mean? It means data analysis expressions. Expressions is a synonym for formulas. And because what we're doing is data analysis or business intelligence, they call them DA, and the X comes from the second letter in expressions. Now, you have to have Power Pivot to create these DAX measures. We want to mention the different words that mean formulas in a pivot table. You might see DAX formulas. You might see DAX measures. You might hear just measures, just DAX. You might hear calculated columns because Microsoft in 2010 add-in for Power Pivot called them measures. Then when they introduced Excel 2013, they changed the name to calculated columns. And now that we're back in the new 2016 Excel, they called it measures again. So any of these words you might see, but all they mean is we're building a formula for our pivot table. Now, DAX measures are amazing because they calculate very fast on big data. We can create a formula once and add it to as many pivot tables as we want. The number formatting we actually add at the moment that we create the formula, and then it actually gets carried around with the formula. So whenever you use it, the number formatting is there. And then there are many more functions in DAX formula language than there are in a normal pivot table. Now let's go back over to monthly report. Now here it is, Power Pivot Ribbon tab. We go to Measures, New Measure. Now, there's the table name, and that's important because whatever table you attach this formula to, that's the field list that it will show up in your pivot table field list. It also will be stored in the data model over below the table, and we'll look at that after we create it. The measure name, this is the name that will show up in the field list. So I'm just going to call it revenue. Tab and a description, DAX measure to add total net revenue. And then I come down here, and I'm going to type SUM. Just like over in Excel, you'll get a drop down when you type a letter. We want the sum function. I'm going to type in open parentheses. And check that out. Here, down a little bit further, there's our table inside the data model. Notice table name, and then in square brackets, there's our field names. This is just like our table formula nomenclature that we've been using with our Excel table feature throughout the class. That's the one we want. Once we select it, we can hit Tab. You can also, once we say open parentheses, we can use our arrow keys to arrow down. Once you find the field you want, you can hit Tab, then close parentheses. Now we come down here. I absolutely love this about our DAX formulas. We can attach a number formatting. I'm going to say, hey, 0 decimal places, because this is a high-level report. When I click OK, there's going to be a new formula that automatically gets dumped into our pivot table. It shows up over here in the field list. Let's see if I can drag down the bottom. And there it is. In 2016, they even have an icon to say this is a function. In earlier versions, they didn't have that f of x. And if we go look at our data model, and I'm using Alt-Tab, there it is down below the table. If you click here, you can see the formula up here. Sometimes it's easier. You can actually just come over and create them over here. If you create them over here, you create the actual field name, a colon, an equal sign, and then your formula. We will actually do that a lot in the last week of our class. All right, let's go back over to our pivot table. So there it is. Now, I'm actually not going to change the report layout to show field names. I'm just going to type the name, month, year, and enter. Now, this pivot table is actually not going to be part of our final dashboard, but the slicer that's attached to it and the chart are going to be used by our dashboard. Now, I want to add a slicer to this, so I'm going to come up to the Analyze, Insert Slicer, and I'm going to select Date, Time, Year, and click OK. Now I'm going to format this a little bit, change the size, and I'm anticipating that later I'm going to add more years. So I'm going to come up to Columns and say 2, 3 columns, resize it a bit. And now, of course, we can use our slicer to select only a particular year, filtering our data set, and our pivot table shows only 2016. We can unfilter it. Now we want to build a line chart Let's go up to Insert, over to the Chart group, and I'm going to select the 2D line. Now I'm going to drag the chart over here. Right-click. I'm going to say Hide All Field Buttons on the chart. I'm going to click on the legend and delete. Click on the title. I'm just going to type Revenue and Enter. Now we can see, of course, this is a chart attached to our pivot table. So when we filter it, instantly the chart is filtered also. All right, now we want to make sure and come over to our pivot table. And we're going to actually attach this slicer to 4 different pivot tables. So we want to name each pivot table. Right-click the pivot table options. Up at the top, I'm going to name it Month Pivot and Enter. Now we have our 2 objects, a slicer, and I'm going to hold Control and click on our chart. So our slicer and our chart. Control X to cut. I'm going to come over to the dashboard and Control V. Now all we're doing is loading up our 2 objects, the slicer and our line chart for revenue over month and year on the dashboard sheet. Later we'll create a couple more visualizations and bring them to this sheet. Now I'm going to control and roll the wheel on my mouse. Now we need to create our second and third pivot table on a new sheet. And I need to access the data model. Now I could go back to the data model and click that pivot table button. But watch this. This is an amazing new option in 2016. Insert pivot table, or we use our keyboard Alt-N-V. And there it is. It's even the default because we have stuff in our data model. Now, in earlier versions, this option wasn't there. You'd actually have to click here and go to Choose Connections. But I love that. Now, we definitely want it on a new worksheet. So use this Workbooks data model, new worksheet, click OK, or hit Enter. Now, I'm immediately going to double-click and call this sheet SalesRep Report and Enter. Now, here's the same data model table. I'm going to drag SalesRep down to row. Instantly, I get a unique list. And watch this. This is amazing. There's our formula. I'm going to drag it down to values. Instantly, it is the sum DAX formula and our number formatting. Now, I will change this one. Design, report layout, show in tabular. Actually, that doesn't matter so much because this pivot table won't show up in our dashboard, but I like to be explicit and have the field name. Now we need to create a bar chart. Insert over to the column, and down here, 2D bar. We can drag this over to the side. Drag the pivot table or pivot chart field list off to the side. Right-click, hide all field buttons. Delete the legend. Delete the horizontal axis. Come up to the green plus. I want to say data labels. Now I'm going to click on the data labels. Control 1. I'm going to move this one over here just for the time being. I want to say inside end. Now with those labels still selected, I'm going to go to Home and choose Font. There's a bunch of different places we can get font. I'm going to choose white. Now I want to click on the columns. And over here I can see I already have my gap width. I want to highlight the gap width. Now this is categorical data, so we cannot reduce it to 0. That's only for histograms where we have an upper and lower limit and nothing between. But I do want to decrease the gap width, so I'm going to type 50 and Enter. Now I'm going to click on the vertical grid lines, delete. Now I would like to attach this chart and this pivot table to that slicer. But anytime I change the slicer, there's not going to be a label up here that says sales rep revenue and the year because our year is not in the pivot table. So we're going to learn a little trick. Now remember, the month report sheet and sales rep report sheet are not part of our final dashboard. They are just sheets behind the scenes generating the summarized data for our visualization. So I'm going to create a second pivot table right here and only add the year field. Alt-N-V to open up our Create Pivot Table dialog box. There it is. Use this Workbooks data model, existing sheet E1, click OK. Now here's our field list. Watch this. I'm going to simply drag the year down to the filter area. Now, right now, I could use the filter dropdown and select various years, but that's not what I want to do. I actually want to attach both of these pivot tables to that slicer. So I'm very carefully going to name each one of these. Right-click, Pivot Table Options. Up at the top, I'm going to call this SalesRep Pivot and Enter. I'm going to click in this one, right-click, Pivot Table Options, and we'll call this Year Pivot Enter. Now I want to go over to the dashboard because remember our slicer is over here. Right-click the slicer, Report Connections. And now we have named our pivot tables. Going on. I'm going to check them all. Click OK. Now I'm going to select 17. Sure enough, of course, it governed this, but it's also governing what happens over in this pivot table, in this pivot table, and in this chart. Now the problem, of course, is for this visualization, I actually want a chart title that includes the year. So right in the cells over here, I'm going to type a label, chart title, colon, and then we'll make our formula that we're going to use in our chart as our chart title right here. Equals, and in double quotes, sales revenue space dash space and double quotes ampersand, and I'm going to join it to this pivot table. Now think about this. This formula is linked to that pivot table, which is linked to the slicer. So when I hit Enter, anytime I change the slicer, which will be on our dashboard, right, 2016, that pivot table changes, that label changes. Now we can connect this chart title to that cell. Solid line around the chart title. Equal sign shoots me up to the formula bar, and I click on cell E5 and Enter. Now the slicer is going to govern everything. This is our finished visualization from this pivot table. All of this is just sitting on this sales rep report sheet, generating the data and visualizations that we want. All right, I'm going to click Control X, come over to the dashboard sheet, and over to the side, Control V. Now we're just loading things up. We still have one more cross-tabulated pivot table we want to create. Alt-N-V. Use this workbook's data model. New worksheet. Click OK or hit Enter. I'm immediately going to come down and call this cross-tab report and Enter. Now our pivot table field list is right here. I'm going to expand, and I want to drag product down to rows, region down to columns. And there's our DAX sum function with number format. I drag it down to values, and look at that. There is our pivot table. I immediately want to go up to Design, Report Layout, Show in Outline. I actually want the field names, but I don't want any of the borders. Now I want to drag the year field. So right here, I want to drag it down to the filter. We're going to do the same trick. We're going to name this pivot table, which of course is part of that filter, and connect it to the slicer. So then this pivot table will also be governed by that slicer. We need to name this. Right-click, Pivot Table Options. I'm going to call it Cross-Tab Pivot and Enter. Now I'm going to go over to the dashboard, and the slicer, I'm going to right-click, Report Connections, and check that cross-tab pivot. Click OK. And so now when we go back over here, it should be sliced or filtered by that slicer 2016. Now our last step for this crosstab is to add conditional formatting for the top 20 values. I'm going to click in a single cell, Home, Conditional Formatting, Top Bottom Rules, Top 10. Now let's change this to 20. And I'm going to add some custom formatting, try to make it blue like the rest of the dashboard. Fill, I'm going to try something like that. Blue right there. I'm going to change the font to bold. Click OK. Click OK. Now, it only appears in one cell, but that little smart tag only appears when you apply conditional formatting in a pivot table. So I click on that, and I can say Selected Cells. All cells showing revenue. I want all cells showing revenue values for product and region. And instantly, the top 20 are highlighted. When we slice this, that conditional formatting will change. Now, I want to leave this pivot table over here, but I do want to copy and paste it onto our dashboard. So we're going to learn how to copy, in this case, a pivot table in some cells, but you can highlight anything you want in Excel, cells, charts, whatever. And when you copy it and go over to paste it, instead of using Control V, I'm going to go up to Clipboard, Paste dropdown. And right down here at the bottom, it says Linked Picture. That is amazing. This is just a picture here. Now notice when I move it, it's got translucent, so I want to add some white fill. Click on the picture, Control 1 to open up the task pane. I'm going to move the task pane over here. Fill, I'm going to say fill solid and change it to white. Now we can arrange and finish our dashboard. What I'd like to do is highlight a bunch of cells, more than I'm going to actually need, and add a background color. I'm going to click the light blue here. Click off to the side. Now we can arrange, and I see one little problem right here. I think I'm going to go back over, since this is a picture, I'm going to go back over to that sheet. I actually want those cells right there to be the same color as these cells. So I'm going to go back over to Crosstab Report. I'm first going to turn off the grid lines, View, Grid Lines, and then I'm going to highlight. And if I can remember what color I used, I'm just going to highlight those. Remember, this is just our input for our dashboard. Home, fill color, and sure enough, there it is, the actual fill color I just used. So boop. And now if I go back over here, of course, because it is a linked picture, it updates. Now I'd like to make both charts the same size. So I'm going to click on one of them, go up to Pivot Chart Tools Format, and over here I'm looking at size 3-inch, and I'm going to change this one to 5-inch and enter. Now I'm going to click on the second chart and do the same thing. 5-inch and enter. Now if I click on both of the charts, I can come up to Format and Align. I guess I'm going to align top. Now I'm going to move this picture. Now with this picture selected, I'm going to select this chart and say Drawing Tools, Align, and let's say left. I'm going to move this chart a little bit closer. I should have aligned it first. Align, and we'll do top. And I'm going to move the edge, right, so it's almost even. Move the slicer over here, maybe right in the middle. And I'm going to add, boom, incorporated period, Control Enter. Change the font size to 20, Control B. So we can control and roll our wheel. Close these task panes here, highlight, and we can go to View, Zoom to Selection, or I do this all the time, Alt-W-G. Now I'm going to click somewhere down below, and there is our slicer. We can slice and dice by year, and all of our visualizations are updating. Now I'm going to Control S, and here's the big drum roll. Remember, one of the hallmarks of a dashboard is when we get new data available, all of this should update. So we're going to go back over to Windows Explorer. And there's our Video 17 Import Text Files folder. Inside was the start. If we look inside the start, we have those 2 years. And by the way, I kept this kind of simple, so we just had 3 files. You could have daily files, monthly files, quarterly, or whatever. But here's our new data we just got as a text file. I'm going to copy, double-click inside of Start, and Control-V. Now, remember, Power Query is looking at that Start folder. So anything inside there will get run through Power Query. All of the steps of removing the columns, organizing the data into the data model, and flowing into our dashboard will hopefully update. Now I'm going to use the keyboard Control-Alt-F5. If you want the location, you could say Data, Refresh All. Also, a lot of times, if you have the query open, you can say Show Queries. You can just right-click and refresh that query. But I'm going to use the keyboard Control-Alt-F5. And just like that, there is our updated dashboard. When I click on 2018, instantly everything updates. It looks like we have a couple top 20 in the Africa region. 2017, one over here, 2016. Now I can unfilter all of this, and there it is. Now, one last thing. We're looking down here, and we notice the try fly. We did not want that as part of our analysis. That's no problem. Here's the original query transaction table. Right-click, Edit. I'm coming back here, and I'm simply going to come and filter for the original query. There it is, try fly. Click OK. And now I'm going to close and load. And I can just click this button because it's already has the location into the data model. So when I close and load, it is gone from all of our analysis, and we can slice and dice. Wow, that was an amazing video about building a dashboard. Here's the finished product, but back over on 1, 2, 3 different sheet tabs. We had our month and year pivot table. We had our SalesRep pivot table. Our pivot table to get the year for our chart title formula. And then back over here, cross tab with conditional formatting. Now in our next video, we'll talk more about cleaning and transforming data in Excel, not just with Power Query, but with some other amazing features. All right, we'll see you next video.